Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to talk about every competitor of Dungeons and Dragons, every new tabletop role-playing game that comes out. And so, every tabletop role-playing game that comes out. Shadow Dark just came out recently, right? So, she got, Kelsey Dion got $1 million on, it was the biggest OSR tabletop role-playing game release on Kickstarter ever, right? And so every week, maybe every single day, somebody releases at least every single week, may almost certainly 2 or 3 times a week. There's a new tabletop role-playing game that comes up and drops onto the tabletop role-playing game market, and they're looking to unseat Dungeons and Dragons as the king of all tabletop role-playing games, right? And so the question is, what is going to do it, right? Does the team is it the team that's releasing that tabletop role-playing game? Are they going to be able to surpass Dungeons & Dragons because they have more talent than the Dungeons & Dragons design team? Or because they have more exposure than the Dungeons & Dragons design team? What creates a winner, right, in the art scene, right? So Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop role-playing games are art. Those are art releases, right? So I've been so I want to talk about this question. Is it talent or is it exposure? If you're a tabletop role-playing game design team, does your talent matter or does your exposure matter, right? And which one should you be working harder on to unseat the king of all tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons & Dragons? Undisputed king. Undisputed, right? All right, so here we go. All right. By the way, Call of Cthulhu being huge in Japan that's a joke, not actually a informative piece of information, right? Like that's cute, right? Like, but that doesn't mean you're the king of tabletop role-playing games, yeah. I'm huge in Japan. It's like literally like, okay, whatever, right? Like, yeah, I think that's a line from a good rock song, it's not really, it doesn't mean your tabletop role-playing game matters. Sorry, okay. All right, so I just listened to Dungeons and Discourse, and she is like raving about Call of Cthulhu. It's like, oh, people love it in Japan, and that's great, but that Japan ain't the world. The U.S. is, right? Like, you're the number one tabletop role-playing game in the U.S. You're the number one role-playing game in the world. There you go, done and dusted, right? So you got this situation where do we land? Okay, so what matters? Your tabletop role-playing game design team's talent or their exposure, right? So I listened to a channel called Big Think, and you can find the link below for an absolutely fantastic video that they did on, and this was a scientist who was saying, I can tell you scientifically which artists are going to be able to sell 5, 10, 20 years from now, be able to sell a single painting for $100,000 or $1 million. And the way they know, it's not talent, it's exposure. It's where was your first 5 exhibits. If they know where your first 5 exhibits were, they know if you're going to be successful or if you're going to fail, right? So it's exposure, it isn't talent. And this is, in my opinion, scientific evidence of why Dungeons & Dragons continues to effortlessly crush every single competitor it has. Because right now, every OSR, every indie creator is going out in there and saying, if I turn the dials on this rule system, it's gonna defeat Dungeons & Dragons. And that is not correct, right? In order to beat Dungeons & Dragons, you have to do what Dungeons & Dragons did, right? And what did it did? Gary Gygax sacrificed everything to make Dungeons & Dragons, right? So first of all, if you're going to beat Dungeons & Dragons, you have to create a tabletop role-playing game that has a good rule set. It doesn't even need to be great, right? It just needs to be good, right? It needs to be good, and that's no easy task, right? You need to make a good, engaging rule set. Not the best, just good, right? That's where every single OSR creator and every single indie creator is stopping right now. They're making good rule sets and they think they'll win. And that's just not true, right? You have to get exposure. Gary created Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, right? With zero risk or zero real help from Arneson, right? He funded the thing. He literally wrote the thing. He published the thing. He did all the work himself. And you know what he did in 1983? 9 years later, he went to Hollywood to get the exposure he needed, and he was successful again, right? He got a Saturday morning cartoon that is watched to this very day, right? And that's part of the Saturday morning cartoon American element of history, American success, right? He got exposure. In 2000, Hasbro went out and did an American blockbuster attempt with Dungeons and Dragons. In 2023, Hasbro went out again and got more exposure with Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. In 2016, right, Hasbro linked with the Duffer Brothers and supported the Duffer Brothers in making Dungeons and Dragons the very heart of Stranger Things. They reached out to Rick and Morty, right? They reached out to Funko Pop. They reached out to Lego. Exposure. The reason Dungeons and Dragons crushes every single competitor they have is every single competitor listens to the fools of the OSR allies and says, as long as you make a good game, that's all that matters. That is not all that matters. Gary Gygax literally sacrificed everything to get the game the exposure it needed, right? He took massive risks. In my humble opinion, I could be wrong about this, I think he lost his marriage, right? Based on the work and the intensity he burned at, right? He lost a lot. And he literally had the Moses era where he couldn't even go into the promised land, right? With the D&D community, he literally was like Moses, where he was, led them all the way across the desert and had to watch as Lorraine Williams made Dungeons & Dragons bigger than he had ever made it, and more successful and more valuable than he ever made it, and handed it off to multi-billion-dollar Wizards of the Coast mega corporation to carry it further and better into the future, right? And so he literally sacrificed everything. And this is the part, OSRs and indie creators, are you ready for that type of sacrifice? Are you ready to understand that yes, you need talent, but the exposure, you have to go out and get the exposure. And if you don't, you lose. And that's exactly what's happened. And that's why Shadow Dark and Pathfinder and OSE and Shadowrun all, fail to, and Daggerheart and Illuminated Worlds all fail to succeed where Gary succeeded. They simply don't understand that exposure is actually more important than talent. It's part of the game, right? It's part of the activity that has to happen to get these things at world-class knowledge, right? At world-class exposure, right? Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking, subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.